I'd like to start by saying that I'm honoured, very happy and honoured to have to be invited to contribute to the event surrounding this exhibition. I should stress that what I'm going to say now is not a commentary or analysis of any of the works here presented by Sia Armajani. Instead, I'm here to offer some thoughts which we might say run in parallel, hopefully anyway. I've taken the opportunity of talking in a gallery ultimately to make some reference to Whitehead's use of the term aesthetic, and I'm going to link this to two of his other terms, namely feelings and emotions. My driving question is, why and how does he think that all of these are different and yet related? But I'm going to start by giving a little biography of Whitehead, for those of you who are unfamiliar. I'm then going to briefly introduce his notion of education, or what I understand by his philosophy of education, and then I'm going to go into the details. Okay, so Alfred North Whitehead was born in 1861 in Ramsgate in Kent. He went up to Trinity College in Cambridge in 1880, where he was an undergraduate fellow and senior lecturer until 1910. His first field of interest was pure and applied mathematics, and he specialised in symbolic logic. During this time, he collaborated with Bertrand Russell, and over a number of years, they wrote the groundbreaking Principia Mathematica, which, if you get a chance to look at the Alfred North Whitehead reading room, there are copies of the 3 volumes of Principia Mathematica there. In 1910, Whitehead left Cambridge, moved to London, where he eventually took up a professorship at Imperial College. Now, this period witnessed a shift in Whitehead's interests towards mathematical physics, and more especially the work of Einstein on relativity. And again, in the reading room downstairs, there's his book concerning the principles of relativity. This move to London led not only to an extension of his ideas on physics and mathematical physics, but also to the practicalities and purposes of universities and educations in general. He took up high-ranking administrative positions in the Senate of the University of London and worked to open up the colleges, I mean this is in the 1910s, and the curriculum, both to women, which was seen as surprising then, and also to local communities. He didn't want the colleges of London, to just be isolated places where people came from all over the world and all over the country to study, but to think of the college as something which was embedded in its community and represented and reflected the interests and needs of the community and included members of the community, whilst at the same time being a place of dedicated learning. So this interest in the role of education carried on throughout Whitehead's life and culminated in the publication of his collection of essays, The Aims of Education. Now, broadly speaking, Whitehead's approach to education sets out 3 main stages. These 3 stages might make up what we could call the rhythm of education. The stages are... Hang on, which one? That one. The first one is romance. The second one is precision. And the third aspect is generalization. Now, Whitehead once remarked, and I didn't know this was going to happen before I came, once remarked that philosophy begins in wonder. And it's in this sense that it is akin to poetry as it carries on. Now, I think he felt the same about all kinds of learning. Its first stage is, or should be, one of wonder, and this is what is reflected by the notion of romance. For example, when we want to learn French, we might have some vague but very strong feeling that there's something important and enticing about France, its literature, food, landscape, music, people, etc. And this is what makes up the romance. It is something romantic which lures us in. But the same might apply to chemistry, architecture, or geology. Before we know what any of these entail, we have a sense of wonder about the worlds they could open up to us. This is the notion of romance, the first move in Whitehead's idea of education. However, in order to become acquainted with these worlds, we need precision, technical knowledge and detail, be it of French grammar and vocabulary, of different molecules and their atomic weight, for example. So this is precision. But once this is gained, we will become no more than knowledgeable and have not really fulfilled the romantic promise if we do not move to the next stage, that of generalization. This involves an awareness of the place of our knowledge in the wider world, of a possible contribution that it might make, not just to ourselves, but to the public world. So we might become aware of the importance of the learning of modern language, for the development of children's minds, or the relation of French to other European languages, or to the history of colonialism. Or we might want to relate our knowledge of chemistry to questions of biology and to questions of life more generally. Not just scientific ones, but social questions of life. This opening up, this generalization, leads us back perhaps to the starting point, that of romance, where the wonder starts again. This reinforces the notion that there is a rhythm to education. It's not that you get to an end point. Once you've been through the processes and the stages, you will then start again and think, there is a romance to the relationship between chemistry, life, biology, and the social world, for example. So there is evidence of such rhythm in the life of Whitehead himself. After the wonder, romance, and precision of his study of mathematics and mathematical physics in chemistry in London, in 1924, when he was 63, Whitehead was invited to another Cambridge, that of Massachusetts in the USA, where he was asked to take up a professorship in philosophy at Harvard University. Here he worked until 1937, and it's during this period that he produced a range of enticing, sometimes difficult books dealing with the broadest questions of philosophy, metaphysics, and the world. Some of these are, and these again are in the reading room downstairs, Science and the Modern World, Religion in the Making, Symbolism, Its Meaning and Effect, Process and Reality, Adventures of Ideas, and finally in 1938, Modes of Thought. Okay. Now, it's sometimes reported that after he gave his first lecture at Harvard, Whitehead himself commented that it was the first philosophy lecture that he had ever attended, because previously to that he'd always been doing mathematics and mathematical physics. But this doesn't mean that Whitehead lacked philosophical knowledge. He'd been reading and discussing philosophy since his early years at Cambridge, but the lack of any professionalised legacy and constraint, which might be conferred by a lifetime in a philosophy department, is evident in the close but sometimes heretical readings of major philosophical texts which run throughout Whitehead's later works. Again, philosophy was a matter of wonder for Whitehead, but again, it required precision and generalisation. Now, given my eulogy on Whitehead and his work, and given that we have a reading room outside, some people might be thinking, well, why aren't we all talking about Whitehead today? Now, there are various reasons for this. If he's so novel, so interesting, why is he not better known? What I'm going to say now aren't given as the reasons, they're just suggestions. One is that after Whitehead left the UK, academic philosophy took a sharp turn away from questions of metaphysics, the meaning of life, the relation of thinking to the world, to science, to meaning. Well, actually not to meaning, that's what they stayed with in the UK. It was replaced, under the influence of the Vienna Circle and the work of Wittgenstein, by a focus on logical positivism and language. Wider philosophical questions, such as those that Whitehead was dealing with in the US, were deemed by UK philosophy, academic philosophy in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, just simply as irrelevant. And in the US, this move towards what is known as analytic philosophy was also in evidence. In the US, Whitehead was sometimes viewed as a continuation of the pragmatism of Charles Sanders Peirce, William James and John Dewey, and the eventual rejection or move away from pragmatism in the US entailed a rejection or a move away from Whitehead as well. And another reason could be that although Whitehead probably, you can't say for definite, probably didn't believe in God, certainly wasn't a theist or deist in the old-fashioned sense, he did discuss extensively the role of the concept of God and the role it had played in Western thought. In doing so, his ideas were taken up by US theologians who developed something called process theology, which was based on and always referred to Whitehead as their source. Now, this movement had great success in theological circles at least, and I think this may have contributed to the perception by supposedly, and still continue today, to supposedly serious secular thinkers that to like Whitehead necessarily involves some kind of attachment to theology. These are just some suggestions as to why Whitehead throughout the 20th century was somehow put into the background. Having said this, his influence does remain in some diverse and surprising areas. And once you know Whitehead's name, once you know A.N. Whitehead, when you're reading various journals, articles, magazines, novels, poems, etc., it crops up more than you might think. In poetry, for example. In the 1930s, Wallace Stevens was both entranced and troubled by Whitehead's philosophy, and this tension is evident in many of his poems. Charles Olson, the American poet, tried to translate Whitehead's major metaphysical work, Process of Reality, into poetry. Gertrude Stein spoke of the importance of Whitehead for her work. I mean, there's a fantastic anecdote. In 1914, Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas had come from Paris to London. They met the Whiteheads, were invited to their country house. They went to the country house. The First World War broke out, and Alice B. Toklas and Gertrude Stein couldn't move back, so they stayed with the Whiteheads for 6 months. They apparently got on fantastically. There's a great story about, I could go on with great stories, but about Alice B. Toklas and Gertrude Stein. To return to Whitehead's major work, Process and Reality, he developed in that what he sometimes calls his philosophy of organism. Now, this was taken up in the 30s and subsequently by the developmental biologists and embryologists Conrad Waddington and Joseph Needham, who both used Whitehead's thought to develop accounts of biological development and life, which didn't take genes or DNA as the sole actors or explanations of life. Instead, they want to give a role to the embryo in its own development. Contemporary biology is now realising the importance of what they call such epigenetics, and hopefully, I'm hoping, the work of Whitehead will gain renewed importance in this. In fact, on the way here, I was reading a Guardian article about Dawkins and about why his notion of the selfish gene is half science fiction. It's half science fact and half science fiction, because it leads us into the impossible place where we give all agency, all activity, all power to the genes, but real biologists, proper contemporary biologists, know that what has to be explained is how the role that the embryo takes, that proteins, the development of proteins out of DNA, is not simply the DNA or the gene causing this, and that we need a sense of an organism in which the power, the potential, the capacity inhabits somewhere else. And although Whitehead doesn't immediately solve the problem, that's not his concern, to solve a biological problem, his metaphysical approach gives ways of thinking which keeps us out of the pitfalls of thinking solely in terms of there being a cause, there being an effect, there being one kind of agent which has effects. So that's just a hint at where we hopefully Whitehead might take us. Now, elsewhere we have, I don't know if any of you know the jazz saxophonist Evan Parker, who recorded an album entitled Process and Reality, in which he attempts to render the ideas of the work musically. So if I double click on this, if I can find the pointer, there it is. I won't play too much of this. Not because it's not good, but just to give you a flavour. That's Process and Reality, according to Evan and Parker. At a recent book launch I was at, the architectural theorist, critic and creator of landscape spaces, Charles Jenks, surprisingly, turns out that he's a lifelong admirer of Alfred North Whitehead, and we had a long discussion. Now, I'm not going to comment on his work and say this is Alfred North Whitehead influenced garden design. Well, it's not garden design, it's sort of creations out of landscape. But in terms of rhythms, process, reality, nature, science, environment, the social, I can sort of see it there, but again, I haven't done no proper study of this, so I'm not going to say anything. This is just me pitching the wider influence of Whitehead. You can also stumble across admiring discussions of Whitehead in writers such as Herbert Marcuse in One Dimensional Man, who suddenly just says, and of course Whitehead says, and you go, well, where did that come from? Donna Haraway, who from her very first book in 1976, Crystals, Fabrics and Folds, I think it's called, when she was still a biologist, comments about Whitehead and his importance. This is the influence of Joseph Needham upon her. She then traces Whitehead's, or there are nearly always references to the importance of Whitehead for her kind of thinking. Judith Butler, more recently it turns out, I was involved in organising a conference on the work of Judith Butler and Alfred North Whitehead. That was in LA about 3 years ago. Turns out that she had studied Whitehead as a graduate student, and she then rethought some of her work and gave a lecture on Whitehead, which was fantastic. Bruno Latour, the STS guy, is very interested in Whitehead, although he keeps that quiet because his great friend, stroke colleague, stroke person who keeps him in check, Isabel Stengers, who wrote Thinking with Whitehead, which again is in the reading room downstairs. He doesn't dare talk about Whitehead because she's such an expert on him. They're friends. He knows that she'll just slap him down if he makes a mistake. And of course, Gilles Deleuze, who wrote one chapter which seems to be influenced, or it says it's talking about Whitehead, although I'm not convinced that it is, but elsewhere in letters wrote about reading the first chapter of Process and Reality and saying, I was bowled over by the great list of categories and propositions at the beginning. So once you know the name, he's there. And there have been moves more recently to sort of reinvigorate it. And that's what I'm hoping to do, I suppose. And very recently I also learned that Martin Luther King was a admirer and had studied Whitehead and quoted him in his Nobel Peace Prize lecture. And if you go to the Martin Luther King Foundation website, they have a fantastic sort of list. It's proper archival stuff. And this is Martin Luther King's original notes on, Whitehead on God, Whitehead on the method of extensive abstraction, moment, its meaning, from a concept of nature, Whitehead, Martin Luther King on eternal objects. Now, again, I haven't studied what he's written about this. I'm not sure if I'm going to, but it's just fun. There are just these traces of Whitehead in these people who I admire, which is always peculiar to note that people you admire the people you know, even though you didn't know that they knew them. If that bit made any sense, you can tell I haven't written that down. Okay. That's sort of my introduction to Whitehead, and that's my introduction to why Whitehead might be of interest now. I'm now going to say what I think Whitehead says in terms of feelings, emotions, and the aesthetic. But please stop me if you want me to go over something again. So I'm going to start with a proposition, which I'm going to hopefully... That's it. Which is that feelings are real. Okay. Now that's the first point I want to make, and it's something that I want to insist upon. Feelings are real. Now, there is an immediate danger here. If you assume by such a statement, I, or Whitehead, want to suggest that human feelings are the basis of reality, or that the model of human feelings, which we are already familiar with, gives some sort of key or answer to understanding the world. If that were the case, then I and he would both be wrong. Whitehead does not want to give any special credence or position to human feelings, but he doesn't want to deny them either. A simple way of putting it might be that given that humans experience feeling, then feelings are an element of reality. That's your first step. It's not that they're unreal, but they're not the key to reality. So feeling, as opposed to feelings in the plural, such as happiness, sadness, or joy, feeling needs to be explained. And Whitehead's hunch is that feeling, as a general notion, is an important aspect of all existence. It is only once this more general aspect has been understood that the specific realm of human feelings can be addressed. So he approaches the question the other way around. Rather than starting with human feelings, he just abstracts out from feeling and says, how can we generalise? Okay. Now, it's one of the markers of Whitehead's specific philosophical approach that he often chooses words which we think we know, which we think we're comfortable with, and then he uses them in a different, rather peculiar kind of way. And it's often noticeable that commentators on Whitehead or readers of Whitehead, whose first language isn't English, pick up on these more readily. The English, sometimes we just skim over them and say, oh, he's using the word aesthetic. I mean, one of the reasons I'm going to talk about aesthetic today is because I suddenly realised once when I was giving a paper somewhere, but I was using the word aesthetic just be thinking, oh, I sort of know what that means. And then realised that Whitehead meant something very specific by it, and he was trying to jolt me out of my comfort zone, to put it in one way, and so I needed to go back. So this is another reason I was pleased with this opportunity to go and think about what's the difference between emotion, feeling, and the aesthetic. Okay. Native English speakers run the risk of passing over these strange uses and missing out on the tension the Whitehead is setting up. So he uses feelings, such as notions such as feeling, emotion, and aesthetic, to lure us in, to give us a foothold in his argument. So you can start reading his philosophy thinking, I know what he's talking about, but very soon he uses this foothold to disrupt our thought, to make us less secure. You're then intrigued, hopefully, and you follow him on his path, and when you come out again, you're on surer ground, one which retains some of the old senses of these words, but now in an enriched one. So in Adventures of Ideas, he says, it throws an interesting light on the belief in well-understood technical phraseology reigning, that an accomplished philosopher censured in print my use of the word feeling as being, in a sense, never before employed in philosophy. But this is exactly what Whitehead is aiming for, to say, oh, well, I think I know what feeling means, but then to use it in such a different way that it interrupts our thinking, to make the familiar strange. In the same discussion, Whitehead says, surely the proper method of choosing technical terms is to adopt terms from some outstanding exposition of an analogous doctrine. So you think you know what feeling means, let's take it, let's explore it, let's see what we can retain, let's see what we can change. Because he says the purpose of philosophy, in Process and Reality he says this, is philosophy redesigns language in the same way that in physical science pre-existing appliances are redesigned. Language is absolutely crucial for Whitehead, but language is not the sole answer. This is where he disagrees with those he left behind, such as Wittgenstein, whose notion of ordinary language as the key to philosophy. Whitehead says, yes, language is absolutely crucial, but language is not the only source and is not the only explanation. Language can lead us to different ways of thinking, but language in and of itself does not hold all thought within the propositions of language, to put it vaguely technically. Okay. So, I think that the point we have to try to understand is that Whitehead wants to be able to provide a conceptual scheme with which we can describe the things of the world that we encounter, such as tables, chairs, speakers, audiences, water, bottles, computers. But he asks us to think, ultimately, differently about the manner in which such things exist. He wants to shift us out of our usual approach, which assumes that the world is populated by objects, things of the world, and subjects, the people of the world. This is not to deny that some such things exist in some sense, but as he puts it in Adventures of Ideas, subject and object are relative terms. Subject and object are not the primary elements of reality for Whitehead. What is more real, if I may use such a phrase, are ultimately feelings. But these feelings he also describes as prehensions. It is these which constitute objects and subjects. So this is why feelings are more real, insofar as they constitute, they make up objects and subjects. Now, Whitehead sometimes seems to use the terms prehension and feeling interchangeably. But although it may seem that prehension is a technical term, one of those horrible things where philosophers invent a new word because they mean something, or they thought of something which nobody else has thought of, so they have to create a new word. Prehension is not a neologism. I don't think I said that right. It is a good, though little used English word, which means grasp or grasping. Prehension is a grasping. Okay? So he uses this word, again, sort of playing with language, a word we should or could know, and then to explicate his position. Because he uses it to express the way in which reality is constituted by these graspings, by interrelations, which he describes as prehensions. So although he thinks that the term feeling and prehensions are technically different, they are very close in terms of their meaning and operation. So just to provide evidence of this, because I don't want to appear as if I'm making it up, positive prehensions are termed feelings, he says, in Process and Reality. Okay. Now, this is why I'm insisting that feelings are real. Indeed, more than that, that feelings are fundamental to reality and to the process of reality. So Whitehead thinks or hopes to overcome the problem which traditionally faces philosophy, that is, that of the gap between individual experiences of the world and what the world is in itself. For the experiences of the world, for Whitehead, are in fact the world experiencing itself in a specific way. So it's the world experiencing itself in a specific way which constitutes reality, and that feeling of itself is always a process. So this is what he means by the process, the reality, and the feelings are what are core and key. What we perceive, what we encounter, might appear to be firm objects and subjects, but this room, which you would think, oh, this is a very solid room, this is a thing, this is an object, is getting warmer. It's the process of it getting warmer, and within it there appear to be a number of different individual entities which consider themselves to be subjects. But as subjects, some of you might be you're always in a process of becoming. You're becoming hotter, more thirsty, more bored, more interested, I don't know. You're becoming something else. And yet you are an individual thing, but you can be taken as an audience too. If I did make a good joke, you might all laugh as one thing. You would be becoming engaged. These are the kind of things which Whitehead is not just allowing us to say, but saying this is where the kind of thinking you need to start with in order to understand the world more properly, more deeply. So this is why he says that you have to understand that feelings are real, because the feelings are the prehensions, which are the modes of grasping of the other entities within the world. Is that making any sense? Good. Good. So, objects. People normally don't like it when you try to get rid of objects. He says something really rather... Well, it seems clear to me as soon as you say it. I often find this with Whitehead. It seems remarkable. He can get you to another position quite quickly. I hope to be able to do it. He says that objects, our description of objects at least, are simply abstractions, and they're not how the world really is, especially scientific descriptions of objects. For example, when you think of carbon, and some bad kinds of scientists, not that all scientists are bad in any kind of way, but so those who sometimes try to explain to us what science is, premise the world on things like, well, humans are organic beings who are ultimately carbon-based, and so to understand what a human is, you have to go in your chemistry lessons to understand a carbon atom dislocated with its 4 valences, so any molecule that would be based on stable molecules such as methane needs to link up, so you need 4 hydrogen atoms, CH4, if you remember your chemistry. Yes. So your understanding of, the real understanding of what carbon is really like, they say, is premised on this understanding of this dislocated carbon molecule. But this, in fact, Whitehead says, is a very powerful abstraction. It is not how the world really is. Now, when we might understand the notion of an innocent individual carbon atom from our chemistry lessons, but this is an abstraction designed to help us learn. It is not how the world really is. Carbon molecules are always to be found in reality, to be tied up in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, or in smoke, or pollution, or in oil fields in Iraq, or in the petrol in a car in London. Thinking of some isolated innocent molecule of carbon, as we like to do in our chemistry lessons, is not how carbon really is. Okay, I'm going to recap before I go on to emotions and the aesthetic. We have to genuinely consider what it means and what are the implications of asserting that prehensions and feelings are real. As I mentioned earlier, Whitehead uses the word feeling in a very specific way, in a way which challenges and has confused many an eminent philosopher. He retains the term feeling, even though we normally assume this to be a concept which is intimately tied up with humans, with emotions, and with the realm of the subjective. Does Whitehead want to limit his philosophy to a description of human feeling? Clearly not. Instead, he takes humans out of the argument. He also takes subjects and objects out of the equation. And what are we left with? Bare feelings, bare prehensions, bare graspings. Feelings, in these terms, are a primary element of reality. And this is where the power of Whitehead's conceptual construction comes to bear. Although we may have rid ourselves of humans, of subjects, and of objects, we find it hard to rid ourselves of the other connotations of the word feeling, such as emotion. Okay? And I would suggest this is exactly what Whitehead wants. And this is what he means when he says that the proper method of choosing technical terms is to adopt them from some outstanding exposition of an analogous doctrine. For we are now in a position to understand the radical demand that Whitehead is making of us to treat feelings as divorced from humans and yet primary elements of reality. So, in order to do this, I'm going to get you a little bit more technical and turn to some passages from his major metaphysical work, Process and Reality. So, I'm going to also turn to the distinction he makes between emotion and aesthetic. Right. I should say, for those of you who haven't read a lot of Whitehead, we're going right into some of the more technical bits. If you're thinking of reading Whitehead, he doesn't always write like this, as you've seen from the lovely quotations on the wall. He has a great way of writing and a great way of summing up, and he's very pithy and imaginative, etc. So please don't be put off with what I say. What I put up now is not the most intriguing. Okay. Oh, I've lost a page. Oh dear. Did I turn over a page? Right. Yes, I did. Oh well, never mind. I'll go back because it's quite important. Because at the end, I was very lucky, although I missed the when C.R. Ramachani gave a talk here. I've heard the recording of it, and he does talk about the importance of public art. So again, I said I didn't want to comment directly on anything that he had to say, but I did want to go through some of the notion of that Whitehead has when he talks about the difference between the public and the private. And this also tells us a little more about feeling. Okay, so if we think about it, we can appreciate more fully why Whitehead chose the term feeling, because there's a double sense to the word, already to the word feeling, one that you already know. It means, in one stage, the apparently private, inward, interior process of an individual. For example, when I feel pain in my tooth, it seems to be the most private thing in the world. It's my pain in my tooth. I'm feeling pain. But there's also another sense, one which goes out into the world, into the public. For example, if you're gripped by toothache in the night, and I feel for my painkillers on the bedside table, this is a feeling which is going out, which explores the possibility of the world. Starfish and any such creature with tentacles are good examples of this aspect of feeling into the world. So in Whitehead's account, there's an outward feeling, but there's also a corresponding inward feeling. And any inward feeling will always have a corresponding outward feeling. The relationship between the private and the public, the single individual and the collective, is not straightforward. So, he says, every prehension, grasping, has its public side and its private side. Prehensions have public careers, but they are born privately. And, another lovely one, the creative process is rhythmic. It swings the publicity of many things to the individual privacy, and it swings back from the private individual to the publicity of the objectified individual. So this again is that the feelings are primary, but these feelings, out of these come the notion of the interior, the subjective, the agent. But these are always related to the object, the external world. There's no simple passage from a selfish gene to a kind of embryo which then creates a certain kind of human, which is then criminal or lustful or clever or intelligent or whatever. It's not that kind of cause and effect. There are these rhythms, these swinging backs and forths, where it's the feelings which are primary rather than the object causing the feelings in the subject, or the subject imposing the feelings upon the object. Okay? So we tend to think that individual experiences occur within humans, and these make up our private experience of the world. So the world is separate from our existence of it. Now, for Whitehead, the world has its own existence, which is divorced from our experiences of it, and the world certainly has its own experiences. One of the main difficulties... Oh, I've jumped ahead. Right, what I was meant to be doing there is summarising the old philosophical approach, which says that the world that we experience is separate from our experience of it, and the world has its own existence divorced from our experience of it. And the world, according to most scientists and philosophers, does not have its own experiences. Whitehead is turning all this upside down by saying the world does experience itself. And we're part of that world, but we're part of a world's experience of itself, if that makes any sense. Sorry, I did mess that up a bit. But this is not just a philosophical point. This separation of our human experience of the world from a world which has no experience informed much of modern science and European culture's view of nature. It saw nature as separate, out there, dead, and our experiences of it not as experiences of how these things are in themselves. This is what Whitehead calls the bifurcation of nature. And it's what he wants to avoid in his philosophy. And this is what he does through the double move, which he allows other entities apart from humans to have experiences. There are feelings throughout the universe. Sorry, I did get that page was out of kilter, so I'll now jump forward to where I was before, which is on processing reality. Hopefully. Right. The primitive form of physical experience is emotional, blind emotion, received as felt elsewhere in another occasion, and conformally appropriated as subjective passion. Now there's a lot going on here, and I'm only going to focus on a couple of salient points. Whitehead, as we know, has insisted that feelings are real, and that experience is the core of reality. And so it is that all feeling is the feeling of other feelings, feelings that have already been felt. Because he's quite radical, he really does go ahead with this dropping out of objects and subjects. If objects and subjects are outcomes of feelings, then you can't then say, slip objects and subjects back in. The feelings have to be feelings of things in the past which have already been felt. Now, the most basic element of this feeling is what he describes as emotion. So physical experience is emotional. And yes, he is talking about what scientists would call waveforms of light, etc., electromagnetic radiation. It is, he would say, in some sense, emotional. I'll explain why. Because we should, again, as with the notion of feeling, we should think carefully what the word means. Now, emotion is clearly derived from a notion of movement, emotion. Okay? Feelings move what was there to what is here. They are vectors, Whitehead says. And importantly, animals, vegetables, rocks, and humans can have these emotions. In that, if you just think of the wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation, which are bringing the sun and the warmth of the sun to the earth, this is a movement. This is what he means by emotional. It is an expending, it is the sun wasting its energy or by providing light and warmth for the world. This is why it's emotional, because it is an expression of the movement, of the grasping, of the feeling of the world. Okay? Emotion simply refers to the basic movement of feelings which inhabits, infects, creates all things which then are instantiated within the world. He puts it really rather nicely. This is talking about humans, though, but this could apply to other objects or entities. A sense of emotional feeling, belonging to oneself in the past, passing into oneself in the present, and passing from oneself in the present towards oneself in the future. A sense of influx of influence from other vaguer presences in the past. The stream of feeling which we are receiving, unifying, enjoying and transmitting. This is our general sense of existence. I'm not sure if it is our general sense of existence, and Whitehead isn't normative and doesn't tell you what to think, but I think he's saying this should be our general sense of existence. That we are carrying the past with us in some kind of way, some of it vaguely, some of it clearly. But this is then transmitted and something which we are then expressing outwards towards the future. And it is this movement of the past to the present, which is emotional, which will then in some way elicit a kind of future. It doesn't just stop now. This feeling is, it's important now that I have pain in my tooth, but this pain will pass and go on to something else. That's why I'm taking the painkillers. And so it is this strange movement from the past to the present to the future, which is what is emotional about feeling. That makes sense. That's why the body is so important, but I don't have time to talk about the body. But having said that, he also says, according to this interpretation, the human body is to be conceived of as a complex amplifier, which I put up because it's just one of my favourite quotations from Whitehead. Okay. Right, there's not too much left. So he also says, and this is moving on to the aesthetic, it must be remembered, however, that emotion in human aesthetic, or even in animal experience, is not bare emotion. It is emotion interpreted, integrated, and transformed into higher categories of feelings. And one such category of higher feeling is that of the aesthetic. But crucially, before I move on, I don't now want to suddenly be saying that the aesthetic only exists in humans, because that would be going against the argument I set out at the beginning that human feelings can in any way offer the key to the world. Humans do have aesthetic feelings, but that's because aesthetic feelings exist throughout, not all existence, because they only exist in higher forms of categories of forms, but they can exist in animals. So animals can have aesthetic feelings. Okay, so one such category of higher feeling is that of the aesthetic, of which Whitehead says, and I was wondering if it was up on the wall, because there is one about aesthetics there, but it's not. It is the aesthetic feelings whereby there is pictorial art are nothing else than products of the contrasts latent in a variety of colours, qualifying emotion, contrasts which are made possible by their patterned relevance to each other. Now the first point to be made here is that pictorial art is not what in itself produces aesthetic feelings. So it's not that you go and look at a painting or an installation and then that somehow simply produces some aesthetic feelings. Oh, that's lovely. Oh, that's horrible. Oh, that's, well, got good form or not. The aesthetic feelings which are encountered in pictorial art are manifestations of something more general, of wider contrasts, which themselves are produced by what he calls patterns of relevance. This may all seem a bit obscure, but I think it's quite clear, and the thing to note is that Whitehead allows for human feeling, that is the aesthetic, in terms of art, but it's not simply a product of humans, and it's not just a reaction to a painting. Aesthetic feeling is an enjoyment of contrast, of patterns, and this occurs throughout existence. To put it bluntly, animals at least enjoy the aesthetic too, and maybe even vegetables. Now, again, the original meaning of the word is important. Aesthetic comes from the Greek, to perceive by the senses or to feel. One way of thinking about this is to think of the medical term anaesthetic, which means without sensation or feeling. So Whitehead is now identifying another kind of feeling, remembering that feelings are real. We've had emotion, which characterises the movement of experience. Now we have another kind of feeling, that of the aesthetic. Now this is the feeling of a contrast. What is red could have been blue. What is round could have been square. What is salty could have been sweet. In each experience of the world, we are aware, dimly, perhaps, of other possibilities. But the awareness of these and the heightened awareness of these, of the patterns of contrast, of what could have been but isn't a negation. Just because something isn't doesn't mean it's a negation. I'm suddenly thinking of Armajani's talk when he insists that negation is not the key. And I would absolutely agree. Contrasts are not about something being about the other, something being just excluded as what is not. It is a contrast between what is present and what isn't present, what could have been present, what is in potential, which is the experience of the aesthetic. And so, as he says, aesthetic feelings, all aesthetic experience of feeling arising out of the realization of contrast under identity. And so you might have, and I haven't given a firm account of how Whitehead gets rid of subjects, of human thinking subjects, but one of the great moves he makes, and one of the lovely anecdotes he gives, is Descartes, who seems to, as the father of modern philosophy, saying that we are always conscious, or we always have consciousness, and we're always rational beings, which are always in some way rationally thinking. Whitehead turns it round, and he has a phrase which I haven't written up, which is, as opposed to Descartes, who says that it is the mind which creates the occasional thought. Now, it's the thinker which creates the occasional thought. Whitehead said, it is the occasional thought which creates the thinker. So it's not that we're all thinkers who then think all the time. We can be thinkers on occasion, and he's not getting rid of that, and he's not saying that we can't be logical, rational, etc. But it is the thought which creates us as a thinker, not the other way around. And so an aesthetic experience of contrast will create us as somebody who is maybe confronted by a pictorial work of art, but it's not that there is an aesthetic sense of judgment in humans as Kant would have it. Okay. So, as I said at the beginning of the talk, I don't want to tie my thoughts on Whitehead back to anything specific in this exhibition, but I think we can link it back to his notion of education. Now, it will be remembered that he felt there were three aspects: romance, precision, and generalization. Now, it seems to me that these notions also characterize our experiences, our feelings of the world on a day-to-day basis. When we're groping for painkillers, turning the pages of the magazine, cooking some food, we start off with a hope, a feeling that something worthwhile is out there or can be achieved. This is the romance. In order to satisfy this, we have to be more selective and to focus. That is a box of tablets and not a box of matches. I will read this article. I will use rosemary and garlic, but not thyme and chili. This is precision. The third stage, generalization, comes about with contrast and a wider sense of the place of the event in the world. I think codeine would have been better than paracetamol. I preferred the last edition of this journal. Nowadays it has too many ridiculous articles. I'm lucky to be able to afford good food at all, but next time I will try this dish with lamb instead of beef. But strangely, these contrasts are our enjoyment of the aesthetic. This is the aesthetic operating every day in our lives. But these are linking us, not in a simple facing of some kind of picture, some kind of video or installation. These are our considerations which appear private, but which go into the wider generalization of the world, the social context, the political context even. Now, I'm going to stop now, and I apologise when I say I'm going to stop now. That just means I'm going to start stopping. Because I've said all that I wanted to say, which is to introduce Whitehead's contention that feelings are real, and to look at the way he differentiates between different kinds of feelings, for example, emotion and aesthetic feelings. Both of these are elements of existence of the world. They are not limited to humans, but the way that we enjoy them makes us human. We are immersed in an ongoing world which we experience emotionally, aesthetically, because emotions and the aesthetic are part of the world. Valuation is an integral part of all existence and is heightened in human experience. Some valuations, some experiences are more important than others. Should I look for a new job? Should we have children? Dare I eat a peach? Some are more concerned than others. But we must value the world, or we will not be, we will die. That's it. Oh, questions. I forgot to say. Does anybody have any questions? Hello.
Yes. Any contact between Alfred Whitehead and Jung and Freud?
When Whitehead died, he asked for all his papers to be burnt, as lots of writers do, but the executors of his will took him literally, and they burned his notes and things. We as a community of people don't really know. But just as I said, for one of the reasons I was pleased to be able to do this paper is because in a previous talk I realised that I was talking about the aesthetic and hadn't really thought through what he meant by the aesthetic. The unconscious is a word that he uses in his philosophy. I think you can say he clearly read Freud. I'm not sure about Jung, but he's clearly read Freud. He's clearly sympathetic to certain aspects of their thinking, but to give a good but honest answer, I just don't know. But I suspect, and it's something I mean to do at some point, I wish somebody would invite me, and I'll go and look at the role of the unconscious in process and reality.
Can I say something? I throughout your lecture, I saw a lot of Freudian thought, and particularly when you were talking about public and internal careers. And to me, it was about conscious and unconscious and your internal working model and how you externalise. So it was almost as though he was trying to put a scientific, a bit like Bion had his own scientific language for his language. He invented algebraic formulas for his psychoanalytic thinking. But I think it's like he's almost reinventing it, and I tried very hard not to think in psychoanalytic terms, but a lot of it was there. And I guess it's however you look at it. For example, you talk about romance, you talk about precision, and you talk about generalization, which to me that's almost like reverie, playfulness, joyfulness in the first stage of learning, to practice the mastery, and generalization is a mastery so that you can actually link it to other things that you're interested in, and the whole business of wondering is what it's all about. So he was influenced, I think. But you won't agree because you're a scientist and I'm not.
Oh, no, I'm not a scientist.
Oh, you were a philosopher.
No, I think I would say simply that Whitehead in Process and Reality is trying to break or get over what is sometimes called the two cultures, where there is science and then there are artistic or humanities, etc. This inability of modern thought to think the world together. Okay, so this is why we had emotions and things within reality, not just within humans. Now, in order to do this, he's trying to create a conceptual scheme which will in some way liberate us, but will enable us to think differently. So I think he would say, if you saw in his thought simply a confirmation of what you already think, then he's probably not achieved what he would have wanted. So, I'm not saying that there aren't links or that things can't be seen which can reflect elements of psychoanalytic discourse. But if Whitehead were just confirming what we think psychoanalytic discourse already said, I think he would feel that he'd not failed or hadn't quite provoked.
I've probably oversimplified it, but I think I want to read his aim of education, because I see a lot of Winnicottian ideas in it. So we really got a lot later.
Yeah, I mean, one of the great things about Whitehead is he does produce and project loads of different thoughts, and people often feel, quite rightly, that there is something which they can take out of it. I mean, people often say, was he a Buddhist? Had he read a lot of Buddhism? And I'd say, I doubt it. He read a lot of theology between 1900 and 1910, but I don't know if he read a lot of Buddhist thought. But there's something else he's offering us. I think this is what it is. There's something else he's offering us.
He's quite a modern man.
Yes. I in my sociological side, I'm worried about calling him part of modernity, because a lot of it's a critique of modernity, so I don't want to,
I'm not ignorant of being ignorant.
Yeah, okay.
Would it be permissible to substitute the word relation for feeling? Is he just talking about relations between things? Or between subject and object? I mean, why is he go for feeling?
Precisely to upset you a bit? Because I would just turn round, but I don't want to sound like an awful analytic philosopher and say, well, what do you mean by relations? Do we really know what relations are? If he was using relations, it's not. He would have. He knows, the problem of relations within philosophy from Locke at least onwards, and the problem of primary and secondary qualities, and Newton, etc. The relation between the thing and the perceiving thing, etc. And he's just trying to not replicate that. So I don't understand why you think that relations is so obvious and explanatory a term that it can get us beyond.
Well, feeling does suggest the human. I know that you spent a long time explaining that it's not about human emotion, but to use that term, is it simply being provocative and making us?
He might have been. He's just saying yes and saying that we're narrow-minded because so you don't think that a starfish or an octopus feels its way around the world? Or I can think of other ones. Loads of insects with their proboscis. It's exactly what they're doing.
He isn't just talking about starfish, as I understand it. He's not just talking about starfish and animals. He's talking about all kinds of objects.
Yeah, a rock feels itself to be warm.
I find that quite strange.
Good.
To use the term feel about a rock.
Yeah, but how else are you going to produce a not a complete but an adequate philosophical account of rocks without reducing them to the old-fashioned objects of Newtonian, after Newtonian physics? If you agree that there is a problem of separating off human experiences from the world from a dead world which comprises a nature made of objects which is fixed, which have no notion of process. If you start thinking of wave energies of light and quantum mechanics, etc., you can't have objects like we used to think of objects in the 17th century. It's just unwarranted and it's incoherent, he says. So his task is to help science, but it's to help psychoanalysis, philosophy, art, etc., etc. So one step is, one step is very provocative. It is to say that everything is a subject. But I couldn't do that now, but one answer is just to say everything is a subject that has feelings. And what do you lose? You don't lose anything. It makes it more coherent, our understanding of the world more coherent. Resistance is because we want to retain feelings for ourselves, but then you have to ask yourself, why do you want to do that? Without wishing to psychoanalyse it. But so subjects have feelings. Everything's a subject and everything has feelings. Oh, hello.
I was just thinking, I agree with you, but I also think, personally, I find that I have to always bear in mind that for Whitehead there is a particular aim, and that's the idea of cosmology. I'm drawing on Isidor Stenger's work on cosmopolitics, and I think the reason why he wants to, he talks about feelings of objects is because he wants to get rid of the dualism that seems to plague modern philosophy, beginning with Kant and in fact Plato. And so the idea is that we cannot understand the significance of human feelings if we don't understand the significance of the feelings of objects. So they're not simply relations, but they are embedded within each other. And even like the term embedded is actually quite problematic because it still relies on. And I don't know how else to describe it. I've been thinking about this a lot, but I think it's precisely to understand that an object and the subject and the human feeling is intertwined, or it's definitely a kind of it's not the question of like which one was first, but it is if we think about like human populations which are situated within ecologies, and they're not simply human beings which are adaptive to these environments, but they develop within these environments, and that's why the feelings of objects are so important.
Yeah, I mean ecology in the wider sense.
And the wider sense,
Stengers is interesting because she's a great commentator on Whitehead, but a thinker in her own rights as well. And she does something sort of the other way around, where she uses the word ecology to not mean the ecological in the sort of biological sense, but then draws it out into the political, the scientific, the ethical, the human, etc. And this upsets some people when she talks about ecology and practices, etc. Yeah, I like the way you put it, although this is, then he gets called a pantheist, or this is where the Buddhist side comes out, but it is nice to think of it as that we can only understand the importance and specificity of human feelings if we allow for feelings to be more widespread. Yeah? Yes, sorry. I know this person. I've met this rogue before.
Feelings ever feel?
Sorry?
Can they ever feel?
Can feelings ever feel?
Can they feel?
Fail?
Can they collapse?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, that's
But I mean, they wouldn't collapse, it's just they wouldn't provoke anything new in the world which could be considered a subject. And there can be negative prehensions, to give a technical answer.
Is that how you would how you define negative prehensions? It's where it actually doesn't get to the feeling. It's something there, but it doesn't. There isn't that engagement.
It's that which I'll talk at the human level, but it doesn't only exist at the human level. It is, if one is taking in certain information within a room, one can't take in all the information. There needs to be a level of precision. So, I mean, to get back to the romance and precision side of things, you know, you walk in and you go, oh my God, this is amazing. Say you walk into a party or a concert or an event. Unless you focus and exclude, but not as a sort of negation, not as some sort of kind of other, unless you have some precision and you look at one thing and then another, or enjoy some smell or some sound, you won't have any precision or fuller enjoyment. And what is not taken in at that moment is negatively prehended.
Right.
So that's a negative prehension.
And you could take that down then to, say, a molecule or a possible molecule where the atoms go like, nah, we're not going to do this.
Yeah,
That would be negative prehension.
I
It's
would.
there, the possibility's there, but they don't make it happen.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So just to sort of follow from that, then the aesthetic feeling would be, it wouldn't be sort of, it would be within the prehension.
No, it would be, I mean, aesthetic feeling is a higher category of feeling, so it would probably be that molecules don't have aesthetic feeling. I mean, you know, but who are we to judge? I mean, sometimes it's important to judge, sometimes it's not important. It's the enjoyment or the realization of the enjoyment of the contrast is the aesthetic. I don't want to go so far as to make every molecule sort of conscious and it's sitting there making decisions about what it's going to do next. I mean, it's a nice word, but it's not to exclude all those operations completely. But insofar as they don't enjoy the contrast or experience the contrast, they're just more likely to do something or not do something. It's a lower level of feeling. The enjoyment of the contrast would be the aesthetic, but animals certainly.
Can I bring this down to a really basic level? Compared to the last chapter, that I suddenly was thinking of the moment of conception. And could you call that an aesthetic experience as well? Because there's only...
I mean, rather than me comment on that directly, one way of thinking about it is there's been quite a few feminist theorists, feminist social theorists and feminist philosophers who take up Whitehead precisely because if that was what they were interested in, as say a scientist, was interested in conception, so they were working as embryologists at UCL or in a hospital, etc., and they wanted a way of describing conception more fully, which didn't reduce it to the way that they felt that certain male scientists had made it a very simplistic set of hydraulics, bang, you know, then, but this would have to be very focused on the actual chemical, biological processes of which I'm ignorant. If they could use that as a way then of thinking about the quality, the emotion of feeling which goes in, yes, but it's not something that I could do because I don't have the technical knowledge to then just go pronouncing, yes, conception is an aesthetic event. But it might be that thinking of it in terms of these contrasts, etc., could help an embryologist, if that makes sense.